The Earl King's Promise, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. Whenever people hear that I used to be obsessed with fairy tales, they always have the same expectation. They hear the word and immediately imagine me sitting in some powder-pink room, surrounded by My Little Ponies, stuffed animals, and storybooks about princesses. Most of these people are the folks I meet online. They have never met me in person or even seen my picture. Were they to actually meet me, to see the dark-rimmed eyes, jet-black hair, and clothing without a speck of colour, I'm sure they would be surprised. My question, though, is why? What is it about the association of women and fairy tales that instantly conjures for these people ideas of being childlike, innocent, and exaggeratedly feminine? Why the expectation that I'll know the words to every Disney song ever written, or wish that my hair was blonde, and that I could spend my whole life dressed like Princess Peach from the Mario games, or Elsa from Frozen? My response to those kinds of stereotypes has always been the same. After allowing these people to explain their misguided perceptions of who I am or what I am about, I ask the same loaded question. Have you ever actually read a fairy tale? Usually this is enough, but on some rare occasions I take it further, explaining exactly the kind of fairy tales I used to like. If that still doesn't work, if they don't go away and leave me alone, then I tell them exactly as I am going to tell you now, precisely when and why I stopped reading fairy tales. The problem sometimes is one of confusion. Most of the time when I ask people if they have ever read a fairy tale in real life, they just smile or shrug and say that of course they have. Online, they type some half-baked nonsense about Cinderella or Mother Goose and expect that to be enough. It isn't. A little digging and a few probing questions usually reveals the truth. What I often find is that, in fact, what they claim to have read was actually read to them, usually by a parent, an older sibling, or a babysitter. This is where the confusion starts. There is an issue with the delivery. Like the poison hidden in the apple, fairy tales are often hideous things made up to seem innocent. A shriveled carcass in a fancy box, presented with a bow on top. The manner in which the fairy tales are told contributes to this. The fact that they are read with a cooing lullaby voice intended to send the listener off to sleep or feel comforted means that the very idea of such stories is linked in the listener's minds with pleasant memories. Fairy tales are forever embedded in their thoughts as positive, comforting things, mixed up with ideas of being safe and secure. Sure, they are fantastical stories populated with strange and fabulous characters, but so is the Muppet Show. For the most part, fairy tales are entirely harmless. Somehow, this association, coupled with the fact that most children encounter the sanitized, watered-down versions of the stories, helps people to overlook the more gruesome or frankly terrifying elements. It is as if the way in which the tale is told somehow blankets the listener, shielding them from the prick of thorns, the sewing wheel's sharper edges, or the snapping jaws of the big, bad wolf. It's only when I ask them to retell the stories, to give me the main details, that the realization begins to dawn on them. As I proceed to point out how inappropriate, macabre, and questionable some of the content is, they start to see through the veil of innocence that youth threw over them. When I then go on to explain that the tales they never realized were so graphic and lurid are the cleaned-up versions, and that if one was to sit down and actually read some of the original myths, they would be horrified, they begin to see that my interest in fairy tales has very little to do with pink rooms and princesses. They also, often, begin to look for the exit. I have always been interested in the darker things. The melodramatic, the grotesque, the arabesque have always fascinated me far more than the mundane and normal. When I first stumbled upon the Grimm brothers' collection of folk tales, and even the later Charles Perrault version with Doré's sinister illustrations, I immediately saw the similarities and parallels between those stories. Both were grown from the whispers rustling through roots in the forest and the Gothic masterpieces of Poe and Baudelaire, stories with which I was already madly enamoured. Here there was as much blood and gore, as many cannibals and creatures, as much witchcraft and wickedness as I'd find in any Gothic story or classic horror comic. From the very beginning, I was fascinated. I scoured every library and bookstore I could, not only for the original tales, but for any academic criticism or historical background I could find on their evolution and composition. Despite my youth, I had always been gifted academically, and can say with some confidence that by the time I was 16, I was somewhat of an expert on my chosen subject, and that with every volume I read, I became more and more enchanted by these tales of men and monsters. I read Jack Zipes and Maria Warner's books. I devoured every obscure scrap of folklore and superstition I could, inquiring after rare documents and older manuscripts that I needed special permission to access. I taught myself German and French so as to better be able to read the works as they were originally written, and made a point of visiting locations where the stories had originated. So that was when I first moved to Germany. I was not excited by the prospect of seeing Berlin and Munich, but by the idea of visiting villages that looked like Doré's illustrations. I longed to explore woodlands and forests that seemed, with their gnarled oaks and mossy lulls, as if they could have been enchanted, carved into some ancient woodcut or pulled from some obscure volume of Germanic myth. I was looking forward to being in folklore country. Admittedly, my desire to explore these wild and lonely places did fit well with my posture of misanthropy and desire for solitude and isolation. "These are places to explore alone," I would announce, "places where I can find the peace and solitude I need and desire." These were the tales I told myself, fables forged of loneliness. In truth, this desire for isolation was actually a way of covering up the fact that my isolation was not entirely voluntary. I was actually sick of being referred to as a loner. I said that I wished to be left alone because I anticipated being alone anyway, and pretending that was what I wanted made things much easier. Having been an army brat for most of my life, dragged around the globe following my father's job in the military, I had, and indeed still have, some pretty serious issues around commitment. Too many times I had invested time, energy, and emotions into other people. I gave myself without reservation to friends, mentors, and lovers, only to have to pack up and leave them behind, their promises to call and write fading a little more with every passing month. Their warmth and light receded into the dark like a floating candle thrown into the ocean, its light growing ever dimmer as it drifts ever further from the shore. Whilst I kept up my end, writing to these distant friends daily, and sometimes more often than that, I would get limited responses. Some would even sever the ties altogether, telling me not to bombard them with messages, or even going so far as to deny that we were ever friends at all. After a while, the pain of such losses came full circle, and would rear its head at the beginnings as well as the ends of relationships. With each new person I met or engaged with, I would feel an overwhelming sense of resentment. Despite them having done nothing to harm me, I would experience a pang of bitterness that blamed them, even in those first moments, for the betrayal of their forgetfulness, the denial that was surely to come later. It never occurred to me that it was me leaving others behind, or that my departures probably inflicted pain as well as accumulating it. To me, it was always their fault for not writing, not keeping in touch, for forgetting the moments and memories we had shared, or that we had ever been as close as we had. After a while, I told myself that I didn't want to let anyone in, for fear that one day, all too soon, I would be forced to let them out again. I suppose from the outside it could be said that this whole process made me a difficult person to get along with, not only because I would suspect people, even at the outset, of preparing to betray me, but because my fear of being left out meant that I formed attachments very quickly, forging bonds that some perhaps found a little too intense or overbearing. These same circumstances also made me feel deeply resentful of my father. How could he, I would ask myself, stand there with a straight face and tell me that we couldn't have a pet because eventually we would need to move on and because giving it back was cruel? "It would hurt," he would say, "if we had to leave the poor creature behind. Hurt us and them." It was better, he would say, if I didn't become attached. He would say this with not a scrap of irony as I packed up photographs of my newly found and lost friends to take with me to the next place. Relics of relationships that were dissolving even as I packed. In Germany, though, I realized it could be different. First of all, there were people there who looked like me. At my last school, a vapid, nondescript excuse for an educational establishment in the Midwestern United States, everyone was the same. The girls were blonde, immaculate, and all aspiring cheerleaders, exactly the kind of girly girls that my interest in fairy tales should have made me. Should have, but didn't. By contrast, here in Germany, there were kids who dyed their hair colors other than blonde and brown, people who had piercings in places other than their ears, and listened to music that was not mainstream and which was best listened to at top volume. Despite my self-professed desire to be a loner and my habit of remaining physically alone, I'll admit that there, in those first weeks especially, I longed for them. I would watch them moving around the college in small clustered groups, and I would hope, dream, that these birds of a more colourful feather would one day absorb me into their flock, that I could, even if only for a short while, be one of them, be part of a group that felt like family. I would, I thought, laugh along with their jokes, buy them gifts, and tell them my secrets whilst keeping theirs close to my chest, swearing and keeping confidence as if my life depended upon it. I dreamt of being invited over to join them, though, of course, the invitation never came. Day after day I would sit alone on a wall in the quadrangle, hoping that perhaps this would be the day that I would look up from my lunch and find people on either side introducing themselves and asking me about myself. I would fantasize about those conversations. Sometimes, alone in bed at night, I would practice them, closing my eyes and imagining individuals that I had seen the day before me. I would work diligently through scripts and scenarios, anticipating possible questions, constructing and practicing witty and impromptu responses, trying and testing anecdotes and jokes, so that when, if I was ever approached, I would have the perfect response to every comment. I would be able, in the blink of an eye, to pull up one of my well-rehearsed responses and have everyone in fits of laughter, so that later, when they were alone without me, they would talk about me. They would all nod and agree that I was the funny one, or that I was cool. They would ask each other to share my number and encourage each other to invite me along again. I made these practice recitations of meetings and greetings every night for a fortnight, until eventually my father, disturbed by my mutterings in the next room, thudded loudly on my bedroom wall with a command to shut up and go to sleep. The first instruction I followed. The second, though, was impossible. When weeks passed and I hadn't made a single friend, I decided to throw money at the problem. Money and time. For a week I spent time sitting close to the groups I wished to be a part of, and then narrowed these groups down to a single target group. Like a lioness whittling down the crowd of wildebeest or zebra to isolate individual victims, I honed my focus on one cluster of individuals. On the wall of my room in the US, I had pinned affirmations. One read, "You can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends." My father didn't like that one and said it was insulting. I eventually took it down and replaced it with another that read, "Friends are the family you choose." I repeated that phrase over and over the day I selected them. "You are the ones I choose," I said to myself. "You are my family." But, of course, they weren't. During that first week, I eavesdropped and made notes. In the small, leather-bound notebook in which I usually jotted my academic notes, I now compiled lists. Bands the group discussed, names of Netflix shows they watched, and what they thought of certain characters. I noted their comments and researched the shows and characters later, listening to the music late into the night to learn the lyrics and become familiar. I jotted down the names of the individuals in the group and made detailed notes of what each was wearing, down to the color and particular brand. In short, like a naturalist attempting to infiltrate a group of apes or monkeys, I bided my time and studied them. The following weekend I went into town and bought an entire drawer full of T-shirts bearing the logos and insignia of bands I had heard them mention or that I knew these groups were interested in. I bought accessories that matched those I had seen the girls wearing, and in one case purchased the entire same outfit from head to toe, jewelry and all. I had planned to get a tattoo on my neck that mirrored an image I'd seen on one boy's backpack, but unfortunately my age and lack of ID prevented me. On one of the days I had waited patiently for the group to move away from the seating area in the common room. Slowly and surreptitiously, I crept over to the sofa and inhaled the smell in an attempt to identify the scent that one of the girls was wearing. By the third attempt at this, I believed that I could recognize the same aroma in another context and succeeded in purchasing the same perfume. My plan, based upon careful study, was to wear those shirts, proudly displaying my own fan credentials, in the hope that someone, anyone, might pass comment, notice an affinity between them and me, and start a conversation. I would wear clothes similar or even identical to those worn by members of the group in the hope that one might notice, and even wore the same perfume as the most popular girl. It didn't work, but I did not dwell on it, nor waste time. Glancing at their exercise books and the names they answered to during roll call, as well as the nicknames they used between themselves, I wrote down each member's moniker and then searched for them on social media. Once I had found them, I deleted my old account and created a new one, built around this new persona constructed for their likes and interests. I photoshopped myself into gig photos and added comments about how I'd attended the concert months earlier, but that I was only posting the photos now. I wrote posts about places I knew they hung out and mirrored their opinions about the characters in certain shows. Then I sent friend requests. Nobody responded. As the weeks passed and autumn gave way to winter, I would deliberately leave my coat at home or refuse to wear a jumper for fear that it would cover the T-shirts, the advertisements I had chosen to display that I, despite appearances, was just like them. Though, of course, I wasn't, because I was still a loner. Eventually, I decided that to get noticed, I would need to force myself into view. I wrote up a detailed plan of how I would physically insert myself into the path of each group member. On Monday, I accidentally spilled hot tea onto the lap of Johan, the tall, blonde-haired boy with the Nirvana t-shirt that matched the one I was wearing that day. The next day, I stole Ruth's mobile phone from her purse during class, only to find it and return it later the same day, making sure to put my number into the contacts before handing it back. Knowing that Klaus always rushed his math homework in the library at lunchtime before class, I made a point to sit in the seat next to him with my completed work clearly on display, willing him to glance over and copy it. Thursday, I made sure to be in the ladies' toilets all lunch because I knew it would be Agnetta's time of the month. She might not have supplies with her, and it would give me the chance to share mine and make a friend. On Friday, with none of my other tactics working, I deliberately jostled Ava on the way down the stairs, shoving violently into her back so that she tumbled and sprawled forwards, smacking her chin on the floor and breaking a tooth clean in half. Looking back accusingly at a boy next to me, I helped her to her feet, whilst blood poured from her mouth. I comforted her and offered to act as a witness when she reported the guy to the teachers or even the police for assault. Running home every night that week, I hurriedly checked my notifications, hoping that one in the group would recognize me and decide to accept one of my many friend requests. Still, nothing came. Alone again at night, I continued my practiced recitations, repeating greetings and imagined conversations over and over, and wishing that I too had a fairy godmother to grant wishes, or that some Prince Charming would make my dreams come true. In the end, however, it was not a fairy or a prince, but a king who offered to give me what I wanted. That weekend I told my father that I was heading into town, and, in an attempt to explain the heavy pack slung over my shoulder, explained that I would be spending the night at a friend's house. With typically detached disinterest, he nodded and half-heartedly grunted some inquiry about the name of the friend. I told him Anthea, and without providing any other detail, headed for the door. Of course, Anthea didn't exist, but then neither did my father's interest or concern. As far as he cared, Anthea's house could be made of gingerbread, as long as it meant I was out of his hair for the evening. Without another word of clarification, I opened the door and disappeared, leaving no breadcrumb trail in my wake. Instead of heading for the mythical Anthea's house, I instead caught the train out to a remote village close to the edge of a forest, of the type that I had dreamt about since long before I had arrived in Germany. Once at the station, I disembarked and began the long walk on foot to the edge of the forest and the mountains on which they were situated. The forest itself was exactly as I had dreamed, a twisted meshwork of writhing oaks and ponderous elms, the spaces between which receded into an inky wash of juniper green, so dark that it looked almost black. Those were the places, I told myself, where stories grew between the roots. But I wasn't here for stories. I was here for the Earl King. Despite their near-universal plundering of fairy tale and folklore, it is interesting that Disney has never yet dared try to depict the Earl King. Consequently, he remains as mired in shadow as he ever was. This character, who appears prominently in the folklore of Northern Europe, particularly in Germany and Scandinavia, is supposedly the King of the Elves. Similar in some ways to the character of Will-o'-the-Wisp, though perhaps with a more definitely physical presence, the Earl King was said to lure and entice children into the forest until they became lost, and once the sun began to set, would kill them either with a single touch of his hands or by devouring them, wrapping his branch-like fingers of willow and vine around their rib cage, and dragging them, screaming and begging, into a mouth like the blackened hole beneath an old tree, snaring them in a tangle of roots until they slid, powerless to fight back, into the belly of the tree itself, swallowed by the cold damp of the soil below. The Earl King himself appears in fairy tales and legends dating back centuries. He was a prominent character in German Romanticism, and even featured in works by Goethe. He was also, in some parts of what is now Germany, considered to be real. Whilst not exactly worshipped, this figure who stalked the spaces between the trees was celebrated and placated in various folk festivals and stylized rituals at the beginning and end of each harvest. Though we dismiss these beliefs today as superstition, the Earl King was considered enough of a tangible threat for actions to be taken on his behalf. Town records from the 16th century show that in some areas, whole swathes of the forest were deemed off-limits after dark, as they were considered to be the Elverkunger's land. Church records of the period speak of bishops and priests performing blessings on axes and saws in an attempt to give them some power or protection against the Earl King, whilst the Museum of Folklore in Bremen has specimens of talismans, tiny men made of flax and branches, intended to be protections against the Earl King's touch. For most of the year, the Earl King was the terror of the fearful. For one day a year, however, the night of December the 12th, he was the saviour of the desperate, a saviour to those like me. The place to which I am referring has a very special relationship with this legend. For around an hour from where the modern village is nestled, deep in the forest and at the end of a poorly marked trail, there stands an effigy, an immense figure, 12 feet tall, in what might, from a distance at least, be described as the shape of a man, though a man it was never meant to be. This effigy, constructed from twists of blackthorn and oak, adorned with elm and branches of pine, depicts the Earl King, standing in regal majesty. It marks the place of the Earl King's promise, and was the reason why I came. As someone who has been forced to watch my beloved fairy tales bastardized by Hollywood and Disney, I am understandably protective of them. For that reason, and to avoid an influx of the curious, I steadfastly refuse to identify the name of the town or the area of forest to which I travelled, safe to say that it is not the statue at the graveyard in Dietenhausen, Keltern, and that those who are determined enough will find what they are looking for if they are willing to put in the research, though I would, of course, warn against it. The Earl King cannot be trusted. The legend, so we are told, is that sometime during the 17th century, huge swathes of this forest were consumed in a massive forest fire. Eager to protect their homes and animals, the inhabitants of the village used their axes to create a firebreak that extended for almost 3 miles around, saving this portion of the forest and allowing it to flourish. According to the story, when the villagers rose the morning after they created this barrier, they found that the trees for several more miles in each direction had also been felled, not through the work of any axe, but either snapped or simply fallen or forced to one side, as if they had laid down for the cause. This miracle was seen as a marker of the Earl King's appreciation to the villagers for saving this portion of the forest, and whilst he remained a feared entity for 364 days of the year, 1212 became known as Earl King's Eve. On that night, the villagers were encouraged to place at the feet of the Earl King the things that they desired, and it would be granted to them. Those wishing for a plentiful harvest might lay stalks of grain, loaves of bread, or fruit. Those wishing for riches would place money or gold. Around these items, bowls of water would be placed with a single leaf floating in them, the idea being that the surface reflections would act as the Earl King's eyes, allowing him to see what had been wished for. After all of my rejections, I came to that place to see the Earl King. I needed to tell him my wish. It took me 3 hours of searching, and the sun was already beginning to set when I found the statue. The small grotto in which it loomed was deserted, the legend clearly having fallen out of practice with the slow procession of years into decades and decades into centuries. Why I had expected others to be there, I don't know. I had only learnt of the tradition from an obscure manuscript found in the Berlin Library years earlier. Was it really reasonable to expect the locals to have continued this tradition over such a long time? Or perhaps they were discouraged by the warnings, carved in German dialect into a rock beside the figure, the warning that wishes should be specific, that the object of desire must be clear, and that above all else, even on this night, the Earl King is not to be trusted. I read that warning over and over, but I took no heed, for who else could I trust when I was, as always, alone? From my backpack I took the photographs, cut from the previous year's yearbook, a copy of which I had stolen from the school library. I had carefully cut out the headshots of each of my soon-to-be friends and collected them together. In every image, all showing the same uniform pose, they looked like gods. All of them, snapped from the chest up and smiling into the camera, appeared like the carved busts of Greek heroes you find in the museums, necks turning slightly toward the viewer, their eyes looking slightly off-center, and the corners of their mouths raised in welcoming, inviting smiles full of warmth, happiness, and acceptance. I wanted them. I needed them. And so I asked the Earl King for them. Placing the collection of smiling faces at the feet of the effigy, glancing once or twice into the face, which though it was made up only of twisted branches, still seemed to somehow frown downwards, the features a crumpled knot of bracken and twigs that flickered with the dancing shadows cast by the leaves, between a look of disgust and one of hard, icy indifference, as cold as the earth below. I placed around the roots of the figure bowls filled with water, and into each placed a single leaf, giving the Earl King eyes to see their faces, the faces of my soon-to-be family. Then, my knees sodden and cold from the mud and mulch below, I stared up and told him, "This is my wish. This is my want. Grant me my wishes, and you shall be my king." I said those words over and over, staring back again and again at the faces of my friends before I finally pitched my tent and retired to sleep. When I awoke the following morning to find my wish granted, I did not give thanks. Instead, I read again the warning inscribed on the rock, repeated over and over again in my head. I had placed the faces of my classmates before the king, images of them smiling into the camera that showed only their head and shoulders. I had told him that this was what I wanted. That morning, with dew and frost still clinging to the leaves, I saw in a pile at the Earl King's feet exactly what I had wished for. Alone in the forest with only the birds, the silent trees, and him there to hear me, I opened my mouth and screamed. Details of murders, and particularly the gruesome mutilations of the victims' bodies, were widely reported. Why, and indeed how, the killer had removed the entire head and shoulders of his victims was never established. The hideous busts missing from the victims, and presumably taken as trophies, were never recovered. Of course, this tragedy upset me, and it was for that reason that I finally decided to give up reading fairy tales. Somehow, after that day, their contents seemed just a little too gruesome. I did, however, pay one final visit back to the spot where the effigy of the Earl King still stood. For whilst I had been warned that he could not be trusted, the Earl King had delivered exactly what I had asked for. The mistake was not his, but mine, a mistake I intended to learn from. No one has ever been charged in connection with the Head and Shoulders murders, though there is a suspect police are interested in speaking to. They were led to this individual by an incident far too similar to be just a coincidence. Almost 1 year to the day after the murders that rocked the city, a local man was found dead with virtually identical injuries. The man was a member of the armed forces. Since the day of his murder, his daughter, a 17-year-old girl who also attended the same high school as the previous victims, has been missing. Interviewed for the local newspaper, teachers and the other students described the girl as a bit of a loner. This has been The Earl King's Promise, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.